Good evening, folks, and welcome to this week's episode of Beer Rating with Sean Connors. This week we're back in Canada. We're going to try a Two Crows Pollyanna Wild Northeast IPA. So basically it's an Indian Pale Ale. It's brewed from Two Crows Brewery out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, so not too far from where I am here in Pooch Cove, Newfoundland. Alcohol content is 7.3%, so that's considered a strong ale, and it's actually right on the can, strong ale. So I'll crack it open and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. You may notice the last couple of weeks I've been using specialty glasses. This week, it's a little something I picked up at the Value Village, a little novelty glass. Looks like inverted, not sure how well you can see it. Looks like an inverted glass in the bottle. So that was kind of cool. First time using it. Alright, for the beer itself, as I said, it's an India Pale Ale. 7.3% alcohol, brewed out of Nova Scotia. It's actually a husband and wife team out of Nova Scotia. If you go on the website, it's kind of cool because you can actually order the different beers online. So basically you submit your order and they'll mail it to you. So that's kind of neat. Actually, on the website it gives a little bit about the beer, and actually what they say on the website, exactly what's on the can. They consider it tropical, fuzzy, juicy, and hazy. And it's definitely a little hazy, which is a little bit common with IPAs. Now, IPAs are Indian Pale Ale, so obviously it's a type of pale ale. And the name comes from basically at the time, back in the day, I'm not a big history buff, so I wouldn't be able to give you a timeline. When basically the British were colonizing India. I don't know if that's a proper word or controlled India, or I think colonized is probably the better word. So basically they had the British troops in India, and being ex-military I can definitely say, troops like their beer. So the problem they had is the regular pale ale they were using at the time, it wouldn't last the long trip to India. So they had to try to find a way to make the beer last, so when it got to India it wasn't gone skunky. So what they did, they actually added more hops, and they heavily hopped the beer, and basically the hops acted as an anti-infectant, and so made the beer stabilize to survive the trip to India, and the result was Indian Pale Ale. And that's pretty well what we got here today. So I'll give it it's definitely, what did I say they call it? Tropical and juicy. It's definitely got a fruity smell to it. Not a bad fruity smell. It's definitely hoppy, which to be expected, being that IPA. It's got a bit of a alcohol taste to it, but it is a strong beer, so that's to be expected. Not quite sure what I think of it. It's not really what I'm used to. As I said before, for the most part I've always been a lager drinker, more Pilsner. I think I mentioned last week, for the last 2 months, 2.5, 3 months, I've been doing this for over a month, and before that I was doing a Christmas Advent calendar. So for the last several months I've been trying different beers, and a lot of ales, a lot of strong beers. And it's funny because a week or so ago I actually went to my standard Pilsner, a macro brewery here in Canada, Molson Coors, which that's always been my go-to beer. But after drinking all the different beers and exposing myself to the beers, a Coors isn't bad, but it's not a, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not a tasteful beer after exposing myself to all these different flavorful beers and the strong beers. I'm going to take another minute or so just to decide what I think about that. I want to talk about, last week we talked about the 4 main components of beer, or the 4 main traditional. We talked about the Bavarian purity laws, or also known as German purity laws. back from the 1500s, where basically the law said you could only make beer using barley, hops, yeast, and water. And a lot of craft breweries, even to this day, they follow that rule. They might add one or two, but a lot of them follow those purity laws as per se. Whereas a lot of your macro breweries, they can add a hell of a lot of different. I think in Canada, I think it's over 100 different ingredients they can use, whereby your typical craft brewer will stick to those 4 ingredients. Anyway, I just briefly showed the 4 ingredients, and I said for the next couple of weeks, I'd spend each week I'd talk about one item. So we talked last week. The first one we talked about was the barley. So I want to talk a little about that. You can see the barley here. You might also hear people talk about, they'll say barley, or they might say malt, or they might say grain. Basically, they're talking about the same thing. The only difference is, normally it was barley. However, nowadays, it's not always barley. You can also use wheat, rice, oatmeal, basically any type of grain. And if they say malt, normally they're talking about normally they're talking about barley. If they're going to use another grain, so such as wheat or whatever, they'll normally say malted wheat or malted oats. Whereby if they just say malt, it's normally barley. What it all has in common, it's a type of cereal. It's a cereal grain. So realistically, all beer is, it's fermented cereal. So don't feel bad if you're having a beer for breakfast. I used to have a t-shirt years ago that said beer, not just for breakfast anymore. Okay, so the process for your malt, in this case barley, this is, your Coles Notes version. Basically, the grain or the barley or whatever you're using is normally wetted and warm. Years ago, they put it on the floor and they aerate it, turn it over every so often. And normally try to get warm air going through. Nowadays, they use vats or vessels or tanks, whatever you want to call it. But the whole purpose of wetting it and keeping it warm is to try to get it to germinate. Basically, have to excuse me, I can't even think of the term. But basically, you want it to sprout. And when it sprouts, it's basically the starches are being released. So as soon as it starts to germinate, then it's got to be quickly dried. And normally what they do, they put it in a kiln, which is basically a type of oven. And you want to do that to stop the germination. I'm having a brain fart here. So you want to stop the process. So once you stop the process, this is normally done off-site, not in the brewery. Some breweries might do it, but for the most part, it's a different industry upon itself. So basically, you get to that point, it starts to sprout, you stop it, you dry it right away. Then it's normally sent to the brewery, where it's what they call cracked. So basically, it's gone through a mill, it's kind of grounded up type of thing. That's when at this point, it's normally considered malt. Once it's grounded up or cracked, it's normally soaked in hot water for about an hour, and basically what that does, it starts to convert the starch to the sugar. And once the sugar is all released, you basically got a liquid with a bunch of spent grain in it, and the liquid is now called wort. And once it's called wort, basically they then separate the wort from the grain, and then you proceed to the next step, which we won't get into right now. But that's basically it for grain, or malt, or barley, or whatever you want to call it. Like I said, it's normally barley, but can also be any type of grain, whether it's wheat, rye, rice, whatever the case might be. So pretty simple process. You get your grain, you wet it, you keep it warm, it starts to sprout, you stop that as quickly as possible. You crack it or mill it, soak it in hot water to convert the starch to sugar. And once you're at that point, the liquid is called wort. That's separated from the spent grain. And then the spent grain is actually, a lot of times, it's more or less recycled. It's sent to farmers for feed. And the next step is what we'll talk about next week. So we got that out of the way. All right, back to this one. I got to give it a rating. It's got a bit of taste to it. Once again, it's a strong ale, which it's not my strong beers takes a little bit getting used to for me, but it's not a bad beer. It's definitely no less than a 3, as I said before. 1 would be I can't drink it. A 2 would be I'll drink it, it's free. A 3 would be a okay beer, a good beer. A 4 would be a very good beer. A 5 would be a heavenly beer. So this week for this one, what am I going to give it? I think for the Two Crows Pollyanna Wild Northeast IPA, I will give this I'm going to say a 3.5. Yeah, I think a 3.5. I'm okay with that. It's a good beer. It's not, I wouldn't consider it for me a very good beer. If you like strong beers, you might look at this and go, wow, this is definitely a 4.5. For me, I think between a 3.5 and a 4. I'll probably go with the 3.5. My beer tasting is developing. Yeah, definitely a 3.5. I definitely have another one. It's probably not one, it wouldn't be a go-to beer for me, but it's not too bad. Alright folks, that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. It's midweek, weekend's coming up. Hit the beer store, pick one up on Facebook or my YouTube channel. Let me know what you think. Am I rated 3.5 or do you think it should be higher or lower? Cheers folks. As always, enjoy responsibly.